Thank you for coming to UCSD for today's event, Shakespeare and Religion. My name is Babak Rahimi. I'm the director of the study for the program of study of religion here at UCSD. The study of religion is an interdisciplinary program, it's an undergraduate interdisciplinary program, and it's supposed to highlight how religion can be practiced and discoursed in these different ways throughout history. Since the beginning of this quarter, we have organized a number of events, which range all the way from an event on climate change and religion to our symposium on October 17th on the Reformation. And the symposium on Reformation was particularly, I believe, a more prominent event that we had this quarter, because in that event, we not only talked and discussed the origins of the Protestant Reformation, but we also talked about its impact, its historical impact, the discussions about how the Reformation influenced different spheres of life. This particular event today on Shakespeare and Religion, I would think, and I like to see it as a follow-up to the Reformation Symposium, given the fact that Shakespeare lived in a, I'm going to put post in a parentheses, a post-Reformation period. A highly important historical period in European history, and I would even argue global history. Now, before we get to today's event, let me just invite everyone to go to UCSD's religion program for the study of religion website. There is an event site there which you could click, and you'll find the program's events coming up for next quarter. The first event that we have organized is an event titled Illegal Traveler and Autoethnography of Borders by Shahram Khosravi, who will give a talk here at UCSD on January 11th. And on January 12th, we'll have a symposium on digital Persianate. In that particular symposium, we'll talk about the connection or the interrelation between technology, in particular digital technology, and the Persianate as a transcultural phenomenon. We also have plans to have a performance the next day, and that performance hopefully will be led by Professor Karimi-Hakak on, well, basically it will be a Shakespearean play in Persian. So I'll have more information on that later. Hopefully we'll post something online, and more on that later. Now, as for today's talk and basically panel, Shakespeare and religion is a topic that has been very much in the minds of scholars, especially since the 19th century. Shakespeare himself was living in an era in which religion, in particular Christianity, was undergoing major changes. The Act of Uniformity in 1558 was a period, identified a period in English history when the Anglican Church was consolidating and England was increasingly moving away from the Catholic Church. Shakespeare, at the age of 6, Shakespeare experienced, most likely was there to experience the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth by Pope Pius V. And that event was important in the terms of Protestant-Catholic relations and also in particularly the English history. Shakespeare was living in this major transition in which vernacular languages were increasingly becoming dominant in the particular national context, and also more importantly, church, state, and society relations were dramatically being changed. There are theories of Shakespeare's religious affiliation. Was he Catholic? Was he, well, there's a debate out there that still is an ongoing debate. Today, however, what I'd like to do is to see to what extent we could push the boundaries in the way in which we think about Shakespeare and religion in this historical context. We have 3 leading scholars here who are here to help us navigate through this fascinating historical topic. The first speaker that I'd like to introduce, we have 3 speakers. The first speaker is Professor Seth Lerer, and I'll introduce each speaker before they come and give their talk. But for Professor Seth Lerer, I think no introduction can do justice. He is the Distinguished Professor of Literature at UC San Diego, where he served as the Dean of Arts and Humanities from 2009 to 2014. He had previously held the Avalon Foundation Professorship in Humanities at Stanford University. Professor Lerer specializes in historical analysis of the English language, in addition to critical analysis of the works of several authors, including, in particular, Geoffrey Chaucer. Professor Lerer won the 2010 Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism and the 2009 National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism for Children's Literature, A Reader's History to Harry Potter. Thank you very much. Please welcome Professor Lerer to our panel, please.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and it's an honor to lead off. I want to begin by talking about some general approaches to Shakespeare and religion, and much of what I'm going to be talking about will be Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1. And so I have some PowerPoints, mostly with my quotations, that you can read. So I'm going to begin with a quotation from David Castan's recent book, A Will to Believe, Shakespeare and Religion. And this is a quotation which I think sums up overarchingly his approach. And he says, religion is central in Shakespeare's plays, but Shakespeare is not a religious playwright. Religion provides Shakespeare with the fundamental language of value and understanding in the plays from the beginning of his career through its end. It supplies the vocabulary in which characters understand themselves and are presented to us to be believed. So for Castan, and as Babak has mentioned, for many recent critics, the nature of belief and the institutions of devotion have become newly central to an understanding of how character and community take shape in Shakespeare, a playwright whose own life spanned the decades of not only Protestant reaffirmation, but recusant resistance, that is, the recusants as the unconverted Catholics. And at stake in these studies is not just to say what was the specific faith to which Shakespeare belonged. Some have argued for what I think of as an underground river of Catholicism in the plays, whether it be from a family inheritance or from a fascination with the ghosts and purgatorial epiphenomena of Catholic doctrine. At the heart of Stephen Greenblatt's book, Hamlet in Purgatory, the cover of which I've illustrated here, lie a whole set of questions about lingering Catholic idioms and ideologies, and in the process about the dramatic possibilities behind them. But at stake may be something larger. Emin Duffy, whose book, The Stripping of the Altars, I have up here, in 1992 published this massive book, which was a revisionary account of the relationship between English Reformation and Catholicism. His argument, broadly speaking, is that Catholicism and what he calls local or popular religion was a vigorous, ongoing tradition that was ruthlessly, in his view, legislated against, stamped out, that it was less a question of ecclesiastical corruption than it was of top-down enforcement by a Tudor thought machine. If there is a moment in Duffy's book that is most revelatory, I think, to readers still, it's the importance he places on Queen Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's elder daughter, with Catherine of Aragon, who ruled from 1553 to 1558, who returned or tried to return England to Catholicism, and who created an environment in which a Catholic, if you like, interregnum or Catholic resurgence had a great impact not only on everyday life, but on the literary culture of the time. And I'll be talking about some of that. I'm interested in the relationship between religion and literature, and in particular, the way in which this changing climate of doctrinal debate and ecclesiastical change had an impact on the way in which men and women in the 16th century read earlier medieval literature. Medieval literature during this time was viewed not just as old or archaic, it was viewed as papist, it was viewed as pernicious, it was viewed as aggressively Catholic. Why? Well, partly because of its own heritage, but largely because it invested in particular narrative techniques of sacramental fulfillment. So, for example, the idiom of the pilgrimage which motivates so much medieval writing, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales being only the most famous example, the idiom of the pilgrimage was associated in early Protestant doctrine with a level of sacramental observance that the early reformers were trying to efface. Therefore, literary works that grounded themselves in the pilgrimage narrative were seen as the go-to word for criticism was papist. Similarly, the quest narrative, the quest for the Holy Grail, the body of Arthurian literature, was seen as also keyed to a sacramental theology, that is, an observance of rituals and rites keyed to holy objects that the early Protestant reformers rejected because they associated it with idolatry. So, the point about earlier medieval literature and about earlier medieval history for this Reformation world was a point about how you use the past to read through the present. In the 1540s, legislation was developed. And so this is the 1543 Act in Advancement of True Religion under Henry VIII. And it condemned, quote, printed books, printed ballads, plays, rhymes, songs, and other fantasies, that's that language, and then I'm paraphrasing, that did not contribute to the maintenance of Henry VIII's, that should be, hang on a minute, Henry VIII's rule, I'm correcting this because we are taping here, there we are, and we will save, and we will this. There we are, Henry VIII, the maintenance of Henry VIII. So the key point here is that earlier Middle English writers were, quite frankly, illegal to read. And in an earlier act in 1542, one of my favorite acts, it was a crime to own a book or to write the word Pope. That is, to own a book that had the word Pope in it, or to write, the phrase was, to write, print, or cipher the word Pope. And one of the fascinating things in the study of book history is when you look at medieval books in early modern hands, what you see still in libraries and in rare book rooms is the word Pope is crossed out, that people went through their books and actually went through this because quite literally people were knocking on the door looking for pernicious or dangerous material. Now, the challenge, of course, was this, that Geoffrey Chaucer and his contemporary John Gower were so popular that they were excluded from this. So the act said that the books that were excluded from this condemnation were the Chronicles, Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's books, Gower's books, and stories of men's lives. And one argument is that this was because they were popular and they couldn't get rid of them. And one argument was because they decided retroactively to try to imagine Chaucer and Gower as proto-Protestant writers. And there's some argument to be made, not today, about the relationship between Chaucer and Gower and early reformist movements. So what happened when Mary Tudor took the throne from 1553 to 1558 is that it gave license to reprint all these old medieval books. And one of the reasons why we have so many copies of Middle English texts, early medieval texts, in British print is because for this brief window, it was legal to print them. And a fascinating history is being written about the way in which the survival of medieval literature is in so many ways the survival of this Catholic underground that after Mary's reign ends in 1558 keeps reading them. So among the books that were most popular and reprinted during the 1550s when Mary was on the throne were two allegories. One of them called Stephen Hawes's Pastime of Pleasure, an exquisitely tedious work of 5,000 lines that even I had challenge finishing. and I've actually have an entire chapter in a published book on it, and the work of John Lydgate, most famously The Pilgrimage of the Life of Man. John Lydgate was known as the monk of Bury, and Stephen Hawes's work, The Pastime of Pleasure, was a popular allegorical romance. In 1570, Queen Elizabeth's tutor, Roger Ascham, published his guide to education called The Schoolmaster. And this is what he said in 1570. In our forefathers' time, when tapestry as a standing pool covered and overflowed all of England, few books were read in our tongue, saving certain books of chivalry, as they said, for pastime and pleasure, which, as some say, were made in monasteries by idle monks and wanton canons. And this is not just a general statement, this is a statement about change in reading taste, and it's a statement specifically singling out these earlier pilgrimage allegories as papist. I hear Roger Ascham's condemnation in the words of poor Tom in King Lear. Mad, masquerading Tom, who presents himself on the heath as so debased that he, quote, eats cow dung, it's up here for salads, that's salads, eats cow dung for salads, swallows the old rat and the ditch dog, drinks the green mantle of the standing pool, who's whipped from tithing to tithing and stock punished and imprisoned. This brilliant image of the green mantle of a standing pool may not only convey the visual impression of the fetid water with a scrim of algae on it, but in turn of what that water represented. The word mantle in the late 16th century meant many things. It meant a cloak, it meant ecclesiastical garb, and it also meant the scum that covered standing water or old wine or beer if it laid around too long. So at one level, he's talking about just this covering over the ditch. But at another level, what he's doing is he is evoking this image of what am I left to do? I'm whipped from tithing to tithing. A tithing was, as you probably know, the command in the earlier church that one give 1/10 of one's income to the church. It came to refer to organizations like villages that were organized around tithings. So what he's literally saying is, I drink the scum on the top of a standing pool and I'm whipped from little village to little village. But what he is figuratively doing is he is giving us a landscape that is linguistically hovering between old beliefs and new imaginations. I'm one of those kinds of readers who finds symbolism and symbolic ritual in a great deal of Shakespeare's language. I believe that Shakespeare is an intensely conscious linguistic writer. And scenes of eating and drinking throughout Shakespeare very often resonate not just with scenes of festivity, but with scenes of communion. And I want to read poor Tom's scene here as a kind of hideous mock Eucharist. Instead of the body and the blood, it's the dung and the standing pool. And it's this kind of imagery that I see as central to the way in which Shakespeare handles the Catholic past and the pre-Reformation historical and literary past. So what I want to turn to in detail is Henry IV, Part 1, a play that is about many things, not the least of which is about the religious history of English kingship. And part of what the play grapples with is the challenge of having an earlier Catholic king be idealized as the forerunner or the ancestor of an idealized Tudor Protestant monarchy. The finesse that Shakespeare has to work is the finesse of presenting Prince Hal, the future Henry V, as someone different from his father, Henry IV. And this is how I want to suggest in which he does it. So before I do this, there is some stuff that I do need to say about Falstaff. And there is some stuff that I do need to say about the Lollards. Now, in Chaucer's time, John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible, who oversaw the translation of the Bible into English, and who led a movement that came to be known as Lollardy, was a proto-reformist or even proto-Protestant movement in the argument that it argued for justification by faith alone, it argued that everyone could read scripture on their own, and it was a profoundly iconoclastic argument because they did not believe that the theater, that the cycle plays or the morality plays were effective. That is, they were like the Puritans in rejecting the spectacle of the theater. Now, in the Henry IV plays, one of the great memorable comic figures is Falstaff. And in the early versions of these plays, Falstaff was called John Oldcastle, who was himself a Lollard knight. That is, he was somebody who was associated with this Lollard movement at the end of the 1300s and the beginning of the 1400s. Some have argued that Shakespeare or Shakespeare's printers and editors changed Oldcastle's name to Falstaff, in part for historical and in part for polemical reasons. There is a long and complicated argument, which I'm not going to go towards, which says that Falstaff is a Protestantizing figure in the play because he's based on this historical Lollard character. That is, that he's a kind of fossil, if you like, of proto-Protestantism. Now, what I find most interesting, however, is the opening of the play itself. And let me see if I have it. Yes, this is the opening speech, or parts of the opening speech, Henry IV himself offers. So shaken as we are, do you mind if I read aloud? Because I am a frustrated theatrical figure. You understand this. And you are a captive audience because you've come this far. You are not getting in the elevator and leaving now. So shaken as we are, so wan with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils to be commenced in strands afar remote? No more the thirsty entrance of the soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. And he goes on. Therefore, friends, now he's guilty. He has usurped the throne. And what is he going to do? We're going on a pilgrimage, guys. We're going to atone for what I did. Therefore, friends, as far as to the sepulchre of Christ, whose soldier now, under whose blessed cross we are impressed and engaged to fight, forth with the power of English shall we levy, whose arms were molded in their mother's womb, to chase these pagans in these holy fields, over whose acres walked those blessed feet, which 1400 years ago were nailed for our advantage to the bitter cross. So what's happening here? What's happening is that King Henry IV is deeply, somewhat anxiously, avowing participation in one of the central traditional Catholic rituals of atonement, a sacrament of healing, by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He's shaken, he's wan, he's care-filled. This is an opportunity for sacramental practice. Whatever specific beliefs the king may have, and whatever actions he performs in the play, this opening announcement of fealty to Catholic sacramental practice marks him for a later 16th century audience as a medieval Catholic. This is a play set 1400, roughly 1400 AD. And so it is set in that historical time, and Henry IV himself emerges as a figure of ritual sacramental performance. In the course of the play, part of the job is to show that Prince Hal is someone not of sacramental performance, but someone of action and belief. That Hal is a figure of deeds. Hal is, if you like, a man of doing rather than of ritualizing. So many have found in Hal's great soliloquy at the close of Act 1, Scene 2, something of this. So here is the opening of this famous soliloquy. I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humor of your idleness. Yet herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world. I've been faking it all along, guys. I have been leading a roisterous, vicious life, and I will reform. So, when this loose behavior I throw off and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am. By so much shall I falsify men's hopes, and like bright metal on sullen ground, my reformation, glittering o'er my fault, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set us off. HAL's speech takes us back through a history of sacrament and service. His key words: humor, idleness, contagion, foul, ugly, strangle. Recall the miasma that greeted Henry IV's opening words of the play. Such language places the ugly in the past, just as Roger Ascham wanted to make the past a place of standing pools and of contagion. Prince Hal will pay a debt. Quite literally, he will redeem. That's one of his big words. And that word, throughout the later 16th century, came to mean both monetary redemption and spiritual redemption. Redeeming time is what he says at the end. Now, Hal's reformation is personal and institutional. My reformation glittering o'er my fault. Since the 1550s, the word Reformation connoted specifically Henry VIII's break with Rome. Yes, it means a personal act of changing behavior, but it also means an institutional act as well. Here are some examples. In 1566, John Rastle wrote about the Popist religion as opposed to the Protestant Reformation. John Bale, around the same time, wrote about the most Christian Reformation of the Church of England. And there's a wonderful piece of poetry that I found, Richard Robinson's A Deal of Daily Contemplation of 1578, where he says, and this is the quote, "And as a prince has chief correction on spiritual state, so may his high prudence into the church cause reformation by favorable means of princely excellence." These lines associate the personal and the political state. They make the issue of reform an issue of institutional and individual correction, and they create an ideal of what it means to be a prince. Such, in a nutshell, is Prince Hal's trajectory. Henry IV, Part 1, works through these acts of redemption to show Hal as a future reformer, as if his acts and idioms anticipated by a century and a half the turn to good works, faith, and scriptural engagement that would mark the English version of Protestantism. Prince Hal's own faith trumps the performance of the sacraments, and he emerges by the middle of the play as a truly redeeming son. In the conversation with his father in Act 3, Hal contrasts what I call his self-embodying sacrality with King Henry IV's externalized sacrality. So let me give you an example. Henry IV is arguing with Hal, what does it mean to be a good king? And Henry IV says, the problem with my predecessor, Richard II, was he was not a good king because he was too performative. He was everywhere. People got to see too much of him. And what they saw was corrupt. He raises questions about Richard II's sexuality, about his consorting with young men, and about his what we would call his dandyism. Instead, Henry talks about his version of kingship. And this is what Henry says. Thus did I keep my person fresh and new, my presence like a robe pontifical, ne'er seen, but wondered at. And so my state, seldom but sumptuous, showed me like a feast, and won by rareness such solemnity. You can see the language here: pontifical, state, feast, sumptuous, solemnity. This is the language that the Protestant 16th century used to condemn what they saw as the theatrical excesses of churchy Catholicism. So when Prince Hal decides, this is what I'm going to do, Dad, the time will come that I will make this northern youth, that is Hotspur, exchange his inglorious deeds for my indignities. Percy is but my factor, good my lord, to engross up glorious deeds on my behalf, and I will call him to so strict account, once again, that he shall render every glory up, yea, even the slightest worship of his time, or I will tear the reckoning from his heart. Again here, it's about deeds. It's about Hal giving us action rather than ritual. He says, I will redeem, once again, I will redeem all this on Percy's head. And in the closing of some glorious day, be bold to tell you that I am your son. When I will wear a garment all of blood and stain my favors in a bloody mask, which washed away will scour my shame with it. Hal's garment is not the sumptuous trappings of a robe pontifical. It's blood itself. The power of this statement, coming right on the heels of his father's, is in effect to say, I am stripping kingship of its papal vestments. I am moving from right to righteousness. It's personal penance here. Now, there's much more in this play, of course, than I can talk about, and there's much in the language of the play that has made many critics see what I'm saying here as a challenge. That is, where's the Protestant and where's the Catholic moving back and forth in a play that first emerged in the late 1590s. But part of what I want to question then is this issue that I raised by quoting David Caston at the beginning. And I'm going to wrap up with my last 2 pages here. And that is, Caston talks about Shakespeare using religion, but not being a religious playwright. In Caston's reading, religion is secondary to art. Dogma is about language, to build character rather than to advance a polemic. Okay, what would it mean to take religion seriously, at face value, in its own terms, in this play and in others? What would it mean to argue that the real goal here is not, in Caston's words, to get fictive characters to understand themselves, but rather to get the living people in the audience to understand each other? Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, these are pedagogical plays. They are plays about teaching. They're teaching each other, they're teaching themselves, and they're teaching the audience. Faith is the engine of dynastic rule. It's fascinating to me how, in looking at the image of pilgrimage, coming to the play as largely a medievalist, we can see how pilgrimage here is not a pastime and a pleasure, but actually a threat. A play like Henry IV, Part 1, compels its audience to reassess its own relationship to its literary and its religious past, to remove itself from the contagion or the standing pool. By the time of King Lear, the quote I'd given you, standing pools and rotten landscapes are only the purview of the exiled and the mad. I'm going to conclude with one last gross overstatement. It has long been noted that the tragic Shakespeare is the Shakespeare of the Catholic Mediterranean or the pre-Reformation Northern Europe. Othello, the Verona of Romeo and Juliet, the Venice of the Merchant of Venice, or the ancient north of Hamlet, or King Lear, or Macbeth. This is tragedy world. Henry IV, Part 1, begins in that world. It moves linguistically and imagistically into a more English and potentially Protestantized world. One way of reading Henry IV, in fact, one way this is my gross overstatement, one way of reading the Shakespeare history canon is to see it playing off on these ideas of the tragic and the comic in terms of religion and cultural location. So that if you read, for example, the first folio, the history plays in the first folio are arranged not according to the chronology of their composition. They're arranged according to the chronology of their subject matter. So they will begin with King John, and then they will end with Henry VIII. And the arc of that movement, I want to suggest, is an arc of a movement from the tragic Catholic, pre-Protestant, or ancient England to an anticipation of a comically restorative local English Protestant world. And what it is designed to teach its audiences is that English history itself can become a narrative of Reformation in all those terms. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention to this and for coming to hear this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. I forgot to add that in my introduction that Seth is also a professional Shakespearean actor. I was just... yeah. I'm just going to wait till... Dan, do you have a PowerPoint or you don't have a PowerPoint? Do you have PowerPoint? Okay, he does. Okay, so we want to... Okay. While Dan does this, let me introduce him and also make a note about all the most important issues that were brought up in Seth's talk. More importantly, I would, as I see it, is the issue, of course, of rites, worship, ritual, as the way it appears in Henry in this particular play, and these are themes and religious or thematic religious ideas that are being explored in Shakespearean plays. The theme of course, death is very much a topic in Shakespeare as well. I'm thinking about King Lear, I'm thinking about Hamlet. And for our next speaker, we do have someone, a great scholar who will speak on Shakespeare in relation to death. Professor Daniel Vitkus is the professor of English and Rebecca Hickel Chair in Elizabethan Literature at the Department of Literature here at UCSD. He earned his master's degree in English language and literature at the University of Oxford and his PhD in English and comparative literature at Columbia University. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including 3 Turks plays from early modern England that was published by Columbia University Press in 2000. His interests include Shakespeare, Renaissance culture, literature, travel writing, cultural studies, literal theory, economic history, global theory, the origins of capitalism, and cultural history of empire. Daniel, would you like to join us? And please welcome Professor Vitkus to the podium. I could give you more introduction.
You're going to find actually a lot of connections between my paper and Seth's paper, which I think is a good thing. And I'm also looking at Shakespearean theater as a place where living people in the audience learn to understand each other, and how one of the things I think it's teaching them to learn is how religious ideology functions in their society, although they wouldn't have thought of it in those terms. Anyway, there'll be a lot of connections here, which I think is going to be nice. All right. Well, as you all may know, last year we celebrated the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and there were celebrations and performances and readings and other events that took place throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. out very easily. To mark the solemn occasion of Shakespeare's death, and one rather literal-minded memorial of Shakespeare's death was undertaken by some who looked at Shakespeare's death place in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church. And in that church, soon after Shakespeare died in 1616, a funerary monument was erected near his grave, and it features this sculptural portrait bearing pen and paper in hand. And J. Dover Wilson once remarked that it made Shakespeare resemble a self-satisfied pork butcher. I think it's pretty accurate. So note the two allegorical putti that are flanking Shakespeare's coat of arms. One grasping a spade, the other posing with the skull and an inverted extinguished torch. These are conventional images of labor and death as rest after labor, perhaps, but along with the skull, quite chapfallen, that crowns these monuments, perhaps we detect a sly allusion to Hamlet, Yorick, and the gravedigger's scene, a scene to which I will return shortly. Beneath the gaze of Shakespeare's effigy, on the floor of the chancel, is his tomb. And there, a stone slab is engraved with the following verses. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. But have these words been heeded? Has the power of these protective words and their curse been effectual? Not if we are to believe the story that circulated about a grave-robbing exploit allegedly undertaken by night in 1794 by a Stratford doctor who hired 3 men to assist him in digging up the grave of Shakespeare and stealing Shakespeare's skull. Until recently, the story was dismissed as a tall tale, just another curious page in the vast book of Bardo mythology. But recently it has been given renewed credence. Over the last 200 years or so, many Shakespeare enthusiasts have, for various reasons, motivated by phrenological fan fever or more recently by archaeological curiosity, wanted to defy the curse, violate the grave, and gain possession of Shakespeare's skull. Horace Walpole was said to have offered £300 for it. Phrenologists hope to find the kind of grand forehead and cranial superstructure that had come to be associated with Shakespeare and was depicted in popular images of the bard. Let's see. Wish I could see the screen. No. Something is wrong. There we go. Okay, so that's an example of a 19th century idealized image of Shakespeare with the cranium and all that, right? Portrait paintings like this one, the Sherborne portrait, which now hangs in the Folger Library, were forged or altered to cater to the growing cult of Shakespeare and to conform to 19th century phrenological ideas about what Shakespeare, as a natural-born super genius, ought to look like. In this case, the hair over the forehead was scraped out and painted over to create a prominent bald area that would emphasize his cranial superiority. The hair was also lengthened at the sides, a style associated with Shakespeare because of the folio woodcut portrait. The date was also altered to 1611 in order to fit Shakespeare's age. In spite of the many requests to exhume Shakespeare's remains, the church officials at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford have respected Shakespeare's wishes and refused to permit anyone to unsettle his hollow dust until recently, when forensic scientists were allowed to disturb Shakespeare's bones in order to find out if someone had disturbed Shakespeare's bones. In 2010, Kevin Coles, an archaeologist from Stratfordshire University, was granted permission to oversee a GPR, or ground-penetrating radar, scan that would look into the grave without digging any dust. The GPR procedure, which began in 2015, was completed in early 2016, and the results indicate that, quote, the bottom half of Shakespeare's burial was consistent with the other graves on the site, showing the signs typical of undisturbed graves over time. But, according to Coles, quote, his head end was completely different, revealing evidence of a disturbance that may have been made by some bold, irreligious grave robber who ignored the epitaph's curse and stole the skull. All of this was revealed in some detail in a documentary called Secret History, Shakespeare's Tomb, which was shown in March 2016 on British television. In the course of the media blitz timed to promote that program and to piggyback on the rising 400th anniversary fever. I don't know, maybe not all of you experienced that fever, but I did. Coles was quoted as saying, "It was a great honor to be the first researcher to be given permission to undertake non-invasive archaeological investigations at the grave of William Shakespeare. With projects such as this, you never really know what you might find. And of course, there's so many contradictory myths and legends about the tomb of the bard. The amazing project team, using state-of-the-art equipment, has produced astonishing results, which are much better than I dared hope for. And these results will undoubtedly spark discussion, scholarly debate, and controversial theories for years to come. Even now, thinking of the findings sends shivers down my spine." Indeed, Professor Coles, you may well shiver if you recall the fate of Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy and then died from a mysterious illness a year after the opening of the tomb. But then archaeologists are scientists and not prone to such superstitious fears. Nonetheless, like the evidence brought to Elsinore by the ghost of old Hamlet, Coles' evidence falls short of conclusive proof. Though the head end of the grave has been disturbed, the visual map obtained by the radar imaging is a murky one and does not, alas, provide a clear image of a skeleton with or without grinning skull attached. The mystery of Shakespeare's skull remains, alas, unsolved. But why would we care whether or not Shakespeare's remains were desecrated to satisfy the curiosity of some 18th century phrenology freaks? What, if anything, is at stake in this little chapter in the history of bardolatry? The obsession with Shakespeare's skull, the fetishization of his bones, and the desire to analyze his grave site using the latest forensic technology provoke a tension between, on the one hand, kind of supernatural, one could say religious, force in sacred material relics, and in the dual blessing and curse that Shakespeare's epitaph invokes in the name of Jesus Christ. Poised against these religious ideas is the material reality of the corpse, the lifeless dust, stones, and bones that remain, the verifiable facticity of dead matter in the grave. This tension between ideal and material, between religious belief in unseen things and the material evidence before our eyes, this contradiction is in fact one of the central tensions found in Shakespeare's great tragedy, Hamlet. Today I want to go on to suggest that Hamlet is a text that asks its audience to doubt. It raises a ghost from the dead only to suggest that such ghosts are figments of the religious imagination. And especially in the gravedigger scene, we encounter a Hamlet whose words work to question those who would fetishize the skull as a sacred object. In Hamlet, the skull, the grave, and the conventional imagery of mortality point to an eschatological tradition taught by the church. But in Shakespeare's play, these grisly artifacts begin to signify beyond received religious truths and toward a radically modern skepticism and an acceptance of death as the end-all of our being. Shakespeare's company could not perform a play that openly promoted an atheistic materialism, but they could present a maybe mad melancholic with a death wish who wants his too solid flesh to melt away into a nothing that would evade resurrection. The skulls that adorn Shakespeare's funerary monument participate in a rich tradition of danse macabre, memento mori, and vanitas imagery. And I want to talk next about how that tradition is deployed, questioned, even subverted in Hamlet. So before we get to the skulls of Hamlet, I need to look at some images from the early modern archive that will illustrate the evolution of this tradition after the Reformation and into the 17th century. And this is The Seventh Age of the World, The Image of Death, 1493 woodcut by Michael Walgemuth from the Nuremberg Chronicle. And this frighteningly festive image is captioned by Latin verse adapted from Petrarch's letter to Giovanni Colonna, which speaks of death as a friend. "Nothing is better than death, nothing nor anything worse than an unfair life. O great death, you are men's eternal rest from labor. You relax the yoke for the aged, God willing, and remove the heavy fetters from the necks of the vanquished. You lift exile and break open the doors of prison. You rescue from indignities, assigning good things to the just by lots, and you remain unmoved, implacable by any technique. On that day preset from the beginning, all these things you command the peaceful soul to bear, the end of its labors having been promised. Without you, the life of the suffering is a perennial prison." Petrarch's poem and the accompanying image emerge from the period of the Black Death and the continuing outbreaks of bubonic plague. This attitude toward death as a helpful deliverer from the sufferings of life is, at least in part, a reaction to the trauma of mass death during the late medieval period and after. In late medieval morality plays and passion plays, in Renaissance performances of the triumph of death, and in spectacles like John Lydgate's Dance of Death from the first half of the 15th century, the Dance of Death was performed live, if you will. It was then transmitted to the visual arts in a variety of forms: mural paintings in churches, tomb decorations, then woodcuts and engravings and oil paintings, and such images proliferated throughout early modern Europe. Here's another example of something that is more in the memento mori category. It's the German carving of a skull. Makes me think a little bit more of the Middleton saw the skull beneath the skin kind of idea from T.S. Eliot. This object emblematizes the relationship between the living and the dead, a relationship that was constantly emphasized through prayers for the dead that were performed in chantries and by surviving relatives as a part of Roman Catholic practice. If we move to Hans Holbein's Dance of Death series from 1523 to 1526, we see images like this in which death comes upon an astronomer, or we see death as a wealthy, well-to-do woman. We see death as a fool. This is the turning in Holbein of the danse macabre to satirical purposes during the period leading up to and following the Lutheran Reform and the radical religious movements that attacked Catholic prelates and their aristocratic supporters. And then, this is a vast history of visual arts. I'm taking a crash course right through this. Hope you don't mind. Then we turn to Andreas Vesalius and his book about human anatomy, De Humani Corporis Fabrica from 1543. He didn't do these woodcuts, of course. In fact, we don't really know who did, but they're wonderful. They're kind of amazing. And you see here there are a number of them, but here I'll just show you a few examples. A skeleton contemplating a skull, which might make us think of Hamlet. Another image of a chap-fallen skull from Vesalius' anatomy book. The grieving skeleton also. And last but not least, the grave-digging skeleton, perhaps digging his own grave, or maybe he jumped out of a grave to dig the next person's. We see here the turning of the danse macabre to satirical purpose. Oops, whoops, fast forward. Here in Vesalius, death is us, not some whirling, dancing force come from beyond the material world to take us to the afterlife. The illustrations in Vesalius' anatomy book are both playful and scientific, indicating the integrated sensibility that preceded scientific specialization. In these images, we can already see the force of a rising skepticism based in material evidence, or the lack thereof. These images gesture playfully and ironically at the religious meaning of the memento mori iconography. While the images from Vesalius embody the transition from the religious tradition of the memento mori skeleton toward a relatively more secular or scientific anatomization of the body, the Counter-Reformation reaction to the Protestants' radical rejection of the imagery of the dead body and body parts as relics, their reaction was to double down on such imagery in increasingly Baroque manifestations. For example, in the Capuchin crypt beneath the church of Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini in Rome, built in 1631, where we find the skeletal remains of 3,700 monks, more or less, arranged in Baroque patterns. But in the same year, we see a Protestant version of the old memento mori skull in this engraved image by Hendrik Hondius. Here, the fragility of life is illustrated by a candle about to burn down, cut flowers that will soon wilt, and an hourglass. The scales at the top of the hourglass and the two wings, one of an angel and the other of a devil, show the two possible final destinations, not three, right? Since purgatory is not an option for the Dutch Protestant Hondius and his intended audience. Here, a woodcut from the Folgers collection translates the Latin memento mori as remember to die, and one of its early readers adds a quotation from the Bible. Quote, "Man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets," from Ecclesiastes 12:5. In broadsides, which are my next two examples, we see the persistence of the Dance of Death tradition that depicts death as the great uniter and leveler, ignoring all worldly authority and reducing social hierarchies to a common humanity. First is the Dance and Song of Death, a broadside from 1569, and the second one is the Dance of Death broadside a little bit later from 1580. Also in portrait and still life painting, skulls were depicted with great frequency and increasing realism in works like FRANZ HALS' Young Man with a Skull from 1627, or the Pieter Kleij's still life that was my first image. As Philip Arias has pointed out in his classic study, The Hour of Our Death, the late medieval emphasis on continuity and communication between the living and the dead changed with the Reformation. And as Michael Neal observes, quote, the Protestant denial of purgatory placed the dead beyond the reach of their survivors. Then death became a more absolute annihilation than ever. According to Arias and Neal, the denial of purgatory, quote, caused psychological damage. Once the souls of the dead and the bodies of the living became utterly separate, and Catholic ossuaries and relics were removed from Protestant holy sites, then the Protestant corpse became not a holy fetish, but, quote, a pollutant, an empty shell, waste matter ready for putrefaction. This shift from living with the dead and their body parts to a more secular, disenchanted culture of death and mortality is part of what haunts Hamlet. And furthermore, the Reformation trauma also produced a sense that both Roman Catholic and Protestant truth claims might be false, as clerics on both sides attacked each other viciously, undermining and weakening the authority of received Christian truths. As we all know, Hamlet is a problem play, full of anguished questions, doubts, dilemmas, problems, both for the characters in the play and for us, the readers or playgoers. A central concern in the play is an uncertainty about what will happen after someone dies. Damnation and salvation, eschatology, the afterlife. And what if they are all lies? What if that is the rottenness, that all we do after death is rot? That the corrupt world of the flesh is the only world? These questions are posed as mere insinuations, but they are present and would have stood out for Shakespeare's audience from the implicating web of contradiction. Death is, for Hamlet, the bourne from which no traveler ever returns. But then a ghost appears who claims to have returned from that undiscovered country to reveal the truth to Hamlet. And what the ghost reveals turns out to be true. Claudius did murder his brother. So why does Hamlet have doubts about the ghost? Because it may not be a spirit of health. It may be a goblin damned, sent to tempt Hamlet and lead him to mortal sin and damnation. In the second soliloquy, Hamlet doubts because he says, the spirit I have seen may be a devil. After all, the ghost claims to be a spirit from purgatory, quote, confined to fast in fires till the foul crimes done in his days of nature are burnt and purged away. Protestants, however, dismissed as superstition the doctrine of purgatory, and the Reformation project included a concerted effort to end the communication between the quick and the dead that for centuries had taken place through the practice of prayer that was informed by the doctrine of intercession. Robert C. Evans in The Rest is Silence shows us how, quote, death provokes this need for thought control in an extreme form, and how specifically in the predominantly Protestant culture of late Elizabethan and Jacobean England, quote, assurance about personal salvation was declining, while attachment to both the external properties and internal subjectivities of the human individual were increasing. The resulting demands on the promise of afterlife became so great that the Christian denial of death threatened to become visible as mere ideology, a manipulative illusion rather than an absolute truth. Beyond the agonizing, paralyzing binaries, devil or spirit, purgatory or no purgatory, heaven or hell, Protestant or Catholic, and so on, lies the possibility that it is all just a tall tale, that in fact there is no afterlife. So the ghost is both a sign of remembrance and a sign of forgetfulness, since it comes in a questionable shape, and its very presence fuels both belief and doubt. The Protestant conception of a clear separation between the living and dead is breached by an uncanny ghost whose presence is defined by an inability to know whether something is alive or dead. Its questionability is derived from a Protestant rejection of the rich and complex spirit world of Roman Catholic belief, which was replaced by a simpler and more stark account of invisible forces organized more tightly along a binary opposition of God and devil, with saints and ancestors much less mobile or accessible to the living. According to the new teachings, a ghost could only be a devil or a satanic illusion. At the same time, the ghost of old Hamlet is a merely theatrical phantom, an actor playing a ghost whose onstage presence goes through a series of stages that mark a process of diminishment leading to a disappearance. From a general haunting of nocturnal Elsinore to a manifestation and communication that is for Hamlet's eyes and ears only, though still audible to his companions, to the ghost's second and last appearance in the bedroom scene where he is visible only to Hamlet and seen as a mere vacancy by Gertrude, and then finally, after Hamlet's return, no ghost at all. In the end, the ghost of old Hamlet, come from beyond the grave, is no longer present. Instead, we witness Hamlet's conversion to a Calvinistic providentialism, one that focuses, as Calvinism tends to do, on an all-powerful God who controls individual fate and determines Hamlet's action. No more consulting with one's ancestors. At the end, the ghost and its admonitions are absent, ignored, unheeded. And of course, what happens in the end of the play would make the ghost very, very unhappy. Let's examine in more detail this process in Hamlet of banishing or displacing the ghost from the afterlife. First, let us consider the opening lines of Hamlet and the exchange between Bernardo and Francisco. Who's there? Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king. Bernardo? He. Here, the conventional order of challenge and response is reversed, disrupted. This confusion indicates and initiates the general uncertainty and disorder that permeates the play. Who's there is a question posed out of a fear of the unknown and asked in a way that ignores conventional conditioned behavior. In one sense, who is there points toward a set of questions about the afterlife. Who is out there beyond this material world? Is there a God, a Father, watching, judging, waiting for us to die, knowing when we will die, guiding us toward our destiny and our preordained place in heaven or hell? Or are we asking the wrong questions? The father that returns from the dead is the ghost, the good father victim of Hamlet's imagining, but he gradually fades away. So the play's first scene sets the tone of anxiety, fear, tension. Something is very wrong, but what? Uncertainty is the watchword for this problem play. Why does the ghost appear? What is the nature of the ghost? Are ghosts really spirits of the dead, or are they demons that take such a form? Horatio only half believes. So I have heard, and do in part believe it, he admits. And as Salman Rushdie puts it in the Satanic Verses, quote, what is the opposite of faith? Not disbelief, too final, certain, closed, itself a kind of belief. Doubt. The play does not advocate disbelief. That would be difficult to pull off, and a blunt absolute atheism is certainly not Shakespeare's game. But Hamlet provides an underlying pattern of doubt about some of the most fundamental truths taught by Christian religion. The play stresses that things are not what they seem, that outward smiles and words sugar o'er villainy and corruption, and that there are hidden mysteries that cannot be known or plucked out by others. This gap between seeming and being, once opened, is never closed in any certain knowing. Hamlet feels that one thing is certain. The world is defined by moral and physical decay. He hopes that his own body and mind will decay and dissolve away into nothing. In Hamlet's first soliloquy, the prince communicates this death wish. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it, fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely that it should come to this. Here, religious law or canon is a kind of weapon, locked and loaded by God, and fear of eternal damnation prevents action to end life. After this initial invocation of God, the threatener, Hamlet sensed that the world is rotten, that society is corrupt, and that to be alive is to be a prisoner in a prison house of flesh and bone, only intensifies. Later, Hamlet will invoke the same threatening deity, lamenting, quote, oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not I had bad dreams. And in Hamlet's third and most famous soliloquy, fear of the unknown again prolongs life, forestalls suicide. Although Hamlet wants to dissolve away, he fears that what he has been taught may be true, that there may be an afterlife, that God will judge him, and that suicide will be punished with damnation. To be or not to be suggests the possibility of continued being in the afterlife, or the possibility that there is no afterlife at all, that death results in annihilation. It is a fear that keeps Hamlet going, the dread of something after death. The whole speech suggests that the fear of the unknown is the basis of belief in metaphysical things, that religious faith is enforced by scare tactics. What happens when we die? To admit that we do not know is frightening. Religion provides an answer with its truth, but Shakespeare's play undermines that truth by building on the doubts that arose from the conflicts and competing truth claims that flew back and forth across Europe following the Reformation crisis. Even in Act 3, Scene 1, when Hamlet has a chance to kill Claudius and decides to delay his revenge further, where he seems to be playing the game by the rules set by Protestant teaching, we can see the scene as one that casts further doubt on religious truth. After all, Claudius' soliloquy is about the futility of prayer, at least for those who are unwilling to show contrition through actions that renounce worldly power. Claudius ends the scene in prayer, asking for divine intervention. His prayers are never answered. Is this because he is an unredeemable villain, unworthy of salvation, or because there is no God to hear or answer our prayers? The latter is a distinct possibility. But what is the connection between this pattern of questioning divinity, of casting doubt on the afterlife, and the memento mori tradition, as Shakespeare handles it in Hamlet? This becomes clear as the action of the play's second half produces a series of corpses and rotting bodies that literalize the figurative pronouncement of Marcellus: something is rotten in the state of Denmark. First, Polonius' corpse is dragged about. Then Ophelia is buried, and the gravedigger must make room for her remains by digging up the skulls and bones of those who were buried in the churchyard not so long ago. Finally, the concluding scene litters the stage with the dead bodies of Claudius, Gertrude, Laertes, and Hamlet. Hamlet's speech at 4:3 invokes the tradition of the dance of death, with its suggestion that all, including rich and poor, powerful and helpless, are equal in the face of death, that kings are subject to king death, and that in fact death brings to kings the most violent violation and deepest degradation of their supposedly sacred being. Quote, a king may go a progress through the guts of a beggar. When Claudius demands to know where Hamlet has stashed the body of Polonius, Hamlet replies that Polonius is at supper. Not where he eats, but where he is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are e'en at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service, 2 dishes, but to 1 table. That's the end. Death is the great leveler. No matter how powerful, virtuous, wealthy we are in life, we all become meat for worms. This is a highly conventional notion, even if it has a satirical import that could be quite subversive in its attack on the powerful and the wealthy. But it is the literalizing of rottenness in the gravedigger's scene that takes the traditional skull or corpse as a reminder of mortality and a warning to be prepared for death, and reduces that symbolic denial of death to a literal confrontation with the body, skull, skeleton, and all as mere matter, as the end-all and be-all of both body and soul. When Hamlet and Horatio encounter the 2 clowns at the beginning of Act 5, they are digging a grave and telling jokes, singing songs. Kind of soundtrack for the dance of death is being performed as the gravedigger throws the old bones out of the new grave while he sings. This representation of the common practice of digging new graves where people had already been buried, and the jocularity with which the remains of the dead are handled, is a mockery of the dead and of decayed body parts that points to the absurdity of the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. And the gravedigger's sacrilegious treatment of human remains provokes Hamlet to launch into a long rant about how the powerful, including fine ladies, emperors, and lawyers, are reduced to stinking dust, dirt, and bones. Again, death is the great equalizer. If it comes to this, asks Hamlet, then what is the use of struggling to acquire material gain or worldly power? But there are insinuations in the play that go against the grain of the conventional contemptus mundi teachings. What if this corrupt world is the only one we've got? What if contemptus mundi is not counterbalanced by a reward of a better life in the next world? Hamlet's contempt for the corrupt world is matched by his disgust with the material reality of death. Confronted with the rotten remains and the skull of his beloved playmate Yorick, all of the teachings about death and the denial of death dissolve away in the face of the materiality of death. Fears about the afterlife are forgotten as disgust for the death and decay of the body takes over. Hamlet is caught by surprise when he half-jokingly, but with a characteristically morbid curiosity, asks whose skull the gravedigger holds in his hand. The same skull, sir, was Yorick's skull, the king's jester. This? E'en that. Let me see. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He had borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning? Quite chapfallen? Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick, to this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing. Suddenly, Hamlet's speculations about the dead, this corpse may have been a lawyer, this one a landowner, become personal. We see him holding in his hand the skull of someone whom he loved in his childhood. This traumatic moment moves Hamlet not to look at heaven or the afterlife, quite the opposite. Instead, it inspires a meditation on the reduction of all humanity, including its greatest conqueror, to contaminated excremental dirt, to base uses. To what base uses we may return, Horatio? Why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till he find it stopping a bunghole? 'Twere to consider too curiously to consider so. No faith, not a jot, but to follow him thither with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it, as thus: Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander returneth into dust, the dust is earth, of earth we make loam, and why of that loam, whereto he was converted, might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Pah, says Hamlet. The text representing in these three letters the gag reflex, that elemental bodily response to the disgusting, as if the disgusting thing is inside you and must be expelled or insists on getting out. But after all this radical materiality, or perhaps in spite of it, Hamlet turns to something beyond the nutshell of his brain. In the play's final act, it might be said that Hamlet submits to God's will, to providence, or to chance, to the flow of events that proceed in ways that he cannot control. Instead of plotting his way to murder like the conventional revenger, Hamlet renounces his duty to avenge his father through a murder plot and abandons himself instead to spontaneous, immediate action, although such action is seen as guided by providence divine. As Claudius testifies, Hamlet becomes free from all contriving. Hamlet returns from his sea journey with a new resolve, which he confides to Horatio. We defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Has Hamlet come to believe in some shaping power beyond the nutshell of his brain, a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will? Hamlet disclaims from any purposed evil, such as a scheme of murder and revenge. His final actions are improvisational, not carefully rehearsed. Despite Horatio's warnings about Claudius' plot on Hamlet's life, he will take up Laertes' challenge. Once he gives up trying to influence the course of events, Providence gives him what he has desired all along. Does Shakespeare raise atheistical doubts only to replace them with Hamlet's seeming faith in providentialism at the end? Once Hamlet gives up the struggle, renounces premeditated plotting, and embraces rashness, he is carried forward to what he wants: his own death and the death of Claudius, caught in a damnable act for which his heels may kick at heaven. But for himself, he wants more than just death. He desires a complete and total disappearance of body and soul. Hamlet imagines a death without an afterlife, without any individuated leftovers, a death whereby this too solid or sullied flesh would simply melt away, dissolve. Recall the image of flesh resolving itself into a dew like moisture on leaves of grass evaporating into the morning sunshine, to be no more. In the soliloquy, this final dissolution leaves no material trace behind, but it also implies that no soul or consciousness would persist after death. Religious language pervades the play's final scene. The exchange of forgiveness by the dying Laertes and Hamlet is a kind of last rite, an expiation, and thus a preparation for the afterlife. Hamlet's killing of Polonius and Laertes' crime of treachery seem to cancel out. Hamlet is absolved by Laertes and his judgment declared by Horatio. Flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. According to this, and the Christian reading that could come from all that, the agony of to be or not to be is resolved when the readiness is all. The opposition collapses in let be. In other words, amen. But perhaps more important, at least for my understanding of the play, are Hamlet's last words: the rest is silence. Oh, I die, Horatio, the potent poison quite o'ercrows my spirit. I cannot live to hear the news from England, but I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice. So tell him with the occurrence, more and less, which have solicited. The rest is silence. Now cracks the noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Poised against Horatio's invocation of angelic song, which assumes an afterlife and a heaven where Hamlet's immortal soul will reside until eternity, are Hamlet's last 4 words. The rest is silence. These words imply the fulfillment of Hamlet's wish for a death without an afterlife. The rest is the final rest of death after we have shuffled off this mortal coil. It is the silence of the grave and the silencing of thought and consciousness forever. No angelic song, no howls of the damned. It is the rest as the remainder. And what remains for Hamlet is silence. After death, no more words. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I should note that the rest is not silence for us. We have another presentation. And somewhere between the satanic and the ghostly, somewhere between wrath and temptation, between redemption and vengeance, between doubt and belief, Hamlet can be described as a tale of the this-worldly and the otherworldly encounters. It's also a story of human agency with the ability to choose while facing the perpetual threat of death as the ultimate destiny that is death. Death, as Dan said, is the great equalizer. For us to have a better understanding of the relation between choice and death and the human living, it is my pleasure to invite Mahmood Karimi-Hakak, the professor of creative arts at Siena College to UCSD. Professor Karimi-Hakak is known for his numerous plays and artistic productions. He is the artistic director of Mahkak International Artists and president and artistic director of Festival Cinema Inevitable. He's a translator, theater, and film artist who has created over 60 stage and screen productions in the US, Europe, and his native country, Iran. His plays and films have received recognitions and awards at such festivals as Edinburgh, Montreal, New Jersey, Tehran, including Best Director in 1979, Outstanding Foreign Film in 1995, Critics' Choice in 1999, and Critics' Pick in 2007. Can you join me in welcoming Professor Karimi-Hakak to UCSD, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mahmoud, do you need to hook up the...
Yeah,
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being so patient. The speeches of the previous 2 scholars is really a very difficult act to follow. I am neither a Shakespeare scholar nor an expert in religion. I'm merely a theater director whose job it is to make sense of what is written on the page for those who see it on the stage. And to do this, I try to get into the mind of the audience, the playwright, not to discover what he thought when he wrote the play, as my esteemed colleagues did, but how he expressed the thoughts he had through the words his characters spoke. At best, I consider myself as a bridge maker trying to connect the past as articulated by the playwright to the present as experienced by the audience. Granted, such a bridge must function as a conduit transferring as much historical, social, and political circumstances of the period of the playwright to the time, place, and environment of the audience. Thus, I attempt to create an association between what was and what is. Therefore, what Hamlet may have questioned, a very small point, what Hamlet might have questioned about the religious philosophy of Elizabethan England may now be presented as an examination of legitimacy of a certain socio-political practice by his 21st counterpart. Or the animosity witnessed in Shakespeare's time between the Catholics and the Protestants may be presented in relation to the hostility we witness in some Islamic societies between the Shias and the Sunnis. I'm also an educator practicing the theater as a means of enlightening the audience. Consequently, it is essential to investigate the ambiguities placed within a play written in the past in order to illuminate their implications in the present. Hence, I look at what Shakespeare expressed in Hamlet not only as a Catholic confronting Protestantism that is forced upon his people, but also as an instigator inciting resistance to similar impositions. Hamlet's objective goes beyond defying fate. Rather, he challenges it. And here I may differ from my colleagues. For example, Hamlet may be as critical about the 2016 American election as he is about his mother's choice of a husband going from a Hyperion to a satyr. Another similarity between Hamlet of the 16th century and today is the despotism of the king. Claudius may do anything to stay in power. Like Henry VIII, he is a total narcissist, he's a tyrant, and he's a womanizer who uses his power to expand the rights of the king. Can we think of a similar leader in today's world? Wouldn't such an approach to staging Hamlet make Shakespeare our contemporary? Scholarly writings on Shakespeare religion and its influence on his plays and his characters well exceed the patience of this paper. However, since this panel is entitled Shakespeare and Religion, let me take a short stroll into, and perhaps a very preliminary stroll into some religious references in Hamlet. As most of us know, the first part of the 16th century England is filled with power struggles, rebellions, wars, and religious tensions. By 1559, with Elizabeth declaring Protestantism as the official religion, Catholics were forced to hide their practice, convert to a new theology, or flee the country. However, by most accounts, Shakespeare is a Catholic, but perhaps, as Daniel mentioned, a more moderate one. Hamlet reflects this mood, a tension between Reformation and Counter-Reformation. In fact, more than any other work of the Bard, Hamlet functions on the moral framework of Christianity. 500 years ago today, that's again a very preliminary thing, a lawyer turned a monk named Martin Luther confronts the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences, where the church auctions out excess of treasury of good deeds accumulated by the saints. Now, the purchaser could then use this capital to balance the sins he has committed or the sins he might commit in the future. Luther, objecting to such doctrine, nails his propositions, known as the 95 Theses, to a church door in Wittenberg. Wittenberg is a center for the study of and debate on Christian theology, Protestantism versus Catholicism. If we agree with British Shakespearean Joseph Pearce that Catholic sympathies, and I quote, Catholic sympathies and sensibilities were an integral part of theatrical life in the 16th century England, then it is possible that Hamlet and Horatio's studies in Wittenberg is to set the stage for a sectarian debate. Shakespeare, deeply Catholic according to Claire Esquith and Richard Wilson, brings Hamlet back to Elsinore to face the corruption spread by the Protestant reformers. Upon his return, the young prince faces his father's ghost, doomed for a certain time to walk the night in purgatory. his mother's marriage to his uncle, a disgrace to say the least, and his people on the verge of yet another war. At this point, all of this points out to something is rotten in the state of Denmark. When meeting his friend and schoolfellow, he remarks, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy," suggesting that what they have studied in Wittenberg may not prove as accurate as the old faith. Every day now, we listen to news. We hear reports of one group of people killing another in the name of religion. In Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and here in America, governments and regimes claim to have God on their own side, labeling the others as blasphemous, immoral, or inferior. 16th century England is no different. Shakespeare, a militant defender of Elizabethan papist resistance, according to Wilson, has Claudius sent Hamlet to England, the slaughterhouse of Catholics, to be killed. Yet Hamlet returns unharmed. If Asquith's suggestions that Shakespeare's work, quote, work is a series of coded messages, if that is accurate, then Hamlet's safe return from England may resemble the bard's escape from censorship. Whether Shakespeare read Tyndale's translation of the Gospels or used the Geneva Bible or the Bishop Bible of 1568, religious principles are evident all throughout his works, as we have heard today over and over. In Hamlet, for example, a good example is the old king loves his wife. They live happily together in a peaceful, prosperous Denmark for years. Then, one afternoon, when he's sleeping in the garden, a serpent stung him. The same serpent who wins away his most seeming virtuous wife with treacherous gifts that have the power so to seduce. Does this not remind us of the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible? Although the debate over religion was dominant during Shakespeare's life, some scholars believe that he left rigid adherence to either faith behind. Could this amount for Hamlet's ambivalence? My colleague called Hamlet a problem play. It's an ambiguous play as well. In one hand, he supports a mere moderate approach to faith. In another, as a true son of a goodly king according to Horatio, and a member of the defiant Catholic group, as Joseph Pierce claims, he questions the new Reformation. Hamlet is struggling with the question of how much control we have, as Daniel again mentioned, how much control we have over our destinies when we face with forces that are beyond our control. He returns home from university abroad to find his country and his family in political and moral turmoil. The rightful heir to his father's throne, he has been bypassed by expedient uncle, who now controls both the crown and the queen. He is unhappy with this situation, of course, but can do little more than just brood about it, until the ghost of his father appears and tells him that he must avenge his death by killing Claudius. Upon seeing the ghost, he assures his friend that it is an honest ghost. That, let me tell you. But a few pages later, again, as Daniel mentioned, doubtfully, however, he confesses that the spirit we have seen may be the devil. The ambiguity spills over to his soliloquy, where he speaks of death as the undiscovered country from whose bourne no travelers returns. Did he not just see a traveler returning from that undiscovered country? This uncertainty seems to stretch over to whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of trouble and by opposing end them. Is Shakespeare questioning how far one might go to defend conviction? Is Hamlet willing to champion saving his people from a governing principle that has subjugated them? A contemporary production of this play, therefore, may help build a bridge leading to understanding the motivations of those who see no way for resisting socio-political oppression other than to sacrifice their own lives. Could this provide enough incentives for a militant who is willing to die for the ills imposed upon his people? For those, from Hamlet, for those who bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contempt, the pangs of desire, despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurn that patience merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might such quietus make. Hamlet, however, makes no such choice because the conscience makes cowards of us all. He prefers to limit his retribution only to the murder of Claudius. Nevertheless, fate has another plan for him. I think Hamlet's moral compass, like that of Shakespeare himself, needs to be considered from many different sides. Hamlet spends most of the play trying to determine through proof and evidence, that the ghost of his father was telling the truth. He tries to maneuver politically to depose Claudius, but preserve Denmark. But that proves useless. Yet, he must be sure that Claudius is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Once he has the proof in Act 5, he defies augury and gives himself up to a destiny, something he realizes that he cannot control through rational action. There is a certain province in the fall of a sparrow, he tells his friend Horatio, a fellow student from Wittenberg. They both, and Shakespeare, would have known the biblical context of this reference. A dozen verses in Matthew chapter 10 could serve as Hamlet's choice between self-determination and fate. Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father, writes Matthew. And he goes on. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Chapter 10, Matthew, verses 34 to 36. One could hardly describe Hamlet's situations more accurately than this. He has to make the right or perhaps the righteous decision and cannot control the outcome. And it is this destiny that takes him to the moment when the assurance he seeks is given to him. Laertes, at his deathbed, cries out, "The king is to blame." It is, however, too far, and the virtuous prince will not stay long enough to see the result of his revenge. Hamlet is caught in a situation much larger than himself. He sees himself as a martyr, and like any other martyr, it is not his own life that matters, rather it is the future of his people that must be of his concern. Could this, by any chance, be how an oppressed suicide bomber thinks? Whether influenced by the writings of Robert Southwell or growing tolerance for the reformist philosophy, at his deathbed, Hamlet prophesied the election light on Fortinbras. Who is Fortinbras? Fortinbras comes from Norway, a place where, unlike England, people are free to choose any religion they want, any practice they want. So Fortinbras takes the role of a liberator resisting tyranny and corruption. Could therefore Hamlet be considered an autobiographical play? There are those who argue, who accuse Hamlet of indecisiveness. Citing his inaction in revenging his father, they believe his melancholy cowardice is due to his fear of death. Why should he wait so long to kill Claudius, they argue, when it is very obvious from the very beginning that the man is guilty? But is he? Hamlet's decision to accept destiny may transfer into a passive activism that has become a way of life for many of our contemporary characters. However, remaining strictly faithful to such references in modern production may seem out of joint, to borrow the phrase from The Prince. Rather, the play works well in a socio-political context of the culture within which it is produced, where hopefully, the audience joins the stage in singing, "Oh, cursed the spite, that ever we were born to set it right." I'm going to show you a 5-minute clip of a video. The video is from a production, a 2011 production, when we placed the Danish prince within the Iranian Green Movement of 2009. It was our aim to familiarize the American audience with the people's aspiration for freedom, dignity, and justice, and to remind them that just like Elizabethan England, Iran's reforms cannot be enforced from above. In this production, dubbed Hamlet Iran, we also took the liberty of slightly revising the last few lines of Hamlet's dying words. They read, "Oh, I die, Horatio. The potent poison quite overcrowds my spirit. I cannot live to hear the words of the people, but I do prophesy that election shall be theirs. So speak this to those who need to see what comes. Each vote, each citizen has my dying voice." I think the bard will forgive us. Let's watch that.
In this harsh world, draw my breath in pain to tell my story. You cannot leave us, my lord. We cannot stand without you, or die, Horatio. This potent poison quite overgrows my spirit. I cannot live to hear the word of the people, but I do prophecy that election shall begin. So speak this to those who need to see what comes. Each vote, country's strength and safety to my breast. There was a time when doubtful of our will, to foreign powers our guidance we did trust. But these sad deaths confirm us in our cause, which is that we must rule ourselves in law, lest mischance and oppression plague us ever. And heaven guide our nation and our hearts, that every voice, that every soul sustain the song of freedom, destiny, and peace. Take out the bodies! Such a sight as this was once our past, but now shows much amiss.
Theater is a living art dealing with live audience experiencing present-day quandaries. Theater's function, therefore, is to reveal the answers of the past to the questions of present. Thus, help its viewer navigate the labyrinth of contradictions that has modeled his vision. In 2017, like 1600, we too need to defy augury. Shakespeare's words must be used as the building blocks of a bridge that connects Hamlet's struggle to ours. It is a must for us, I believe, to contemplate the Prince's providence. If it be now, it's not to come. If it is not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought since it's such an intimate gathering, have a few minutes of questions, and I could simply, gather questions, and have the microphone and give it to the speaker to give that question to the answer. I think that's probably the best method to do this. Are there any questions for us, guest speakers? Would you like to?
Okay. Well, thank you for putting on this event today. I have a question for Professor Lerer. So you started with the discussion of David Kasten's text, and what I see in the passage that you presented from him is this reluctance to assign any sort of religious belief to Shakespeare himself, actually. And I wanted to ask you if you see in maybe this early modern use of the term papist and this attempt to really reject medieval religion, do you see in modern readers an attempt to kind of de-ritualize Shakespeare? That's one question. The other question I had is about the texts described as men's lives. How would those be defined specifically under that act? It seems like that would be a category that would apply to so many texts.
So The second question is easier to answer, that the word life in Middle English and in early modern English is really hagiography. It refers specifically to exemplary and holy lives. So it's not just simply the lives of men. It is, it is teachable narratives of holiness or of exemplary behavior. The first question is a more complicated one, and I guess the way I would put it would be this, that just as in discussions of gender and sexuality, part of the challenge is, where do we want to locate belief? Where do we want to locate identity? And part of the challenge in not just Shakespeare, but in most authorially grounded literature, is, do we want to see it as part of the author's identity, or do we want to externalize it into a cultural or historical phenomenon? So questions like, was Shakespeare Catholic, to me, have the same status of, was Shakespeare gay? That is, that they're fundamentally, that they may be of interest in a prurient way, but that they're, to me, fundamentally uninteresting in terms of understanding the plays as performed and received, as watched and as read phenomena. So I think part of the issue, though, is this, that I think part of what Castan is working through, and part of what certainly Duffy and Greenblatt are working through, was the way in which at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, religion came to replace theory as the narrative or the discourse of understanding or explanation. That is, that in the, with the decline, I mean, my view of this historically is that with the decline of high literary theory, some overarching program needed to replace the theoretical model that had been grounded in the study of language or in structuralism, post-structuralism, and that religion or religious discourse or theology came to imagine that. And so in a comparable way, what Castan is a great synthesizer of other people's ideas, and things like, Shakespeare and the history of Shakespeare in the book, or Shakespeare after theory, or Shakespeare and religion. These are digests. They're, taking the barometric pressure of a particular critical or academic moment. And the barometric pressure that he's taking, I think, is here to say that in the absence of something like, sustained literary theory, religion provides us with a vocabulary for understanding the kinds of things, or talking about the kinds of things that literary theory did. For example, what is the social function of literature? What is the relationship between the sign and the thing signified? How are the ways in which social organizations presenting valuable commodities or objects that take on a certain kind of fetishistic or valuable notion? And and I think that to me is the larger context in which a work like Castan's, or in which several of these other works have taken shape. So I think the real question that I'm trying to ask is, what would it mean to see the goal of studying Shakespeare and religion not as an aesthetic goal, but as a fundamentally religious goal, as an ideological goal? That is, what would it mean to read the cycle of history plays, for example, as an argument about not just English political, but religious history? What would it mean to polemicize the study of religion or the practice of religion in the playhouse? How does the playhouse and its audience become analogous to the church and its congregation? And how do the performance of acts of sacred or ritual life in the fiction of the theater take on a meaning or an effect outside the theater? So, for example, I'll finish with this. If you see a character pray on stage, even though that is within the fiction of a performance, does it have the force of prayer? Can it have the same kind of impact that prayer in private or prayer performed before a congregation might? What does it mean to pray to, what does it mean for an actor to say, "Oh God, God"? What does it mean to invoke? Do we simply suspend our beliefs because it's a fiction of a theater? Or do we recognize that there is this possibility that saying certain kinds of things on the stage can have potentially as ideological or political or theological freight as saying them in a church or saying them to yourself? That's what you see what I mean? That's what I'm getting at. And that's the thing that I think a lot of aestheticizing literary critics don't want to go towards. Does that answer your question, Roy?
I just am wondering about the reluctance to. I guess I've just noticed a reluctance to see Shakespeare as religious, and maybe the issue is assigning an identity, as you say, but maybe it's also a reluctance to say that these plays could have religious impact. So, thank you very much.
Is there another question? Yes, Razwan.
Oh, we're recording. Oh, okay. Yeah, I enjoyed your talk, Professor Vitkus, on this account of death, and in particular, your reference to VESALIUS, the Humani Corporis Fabrica, and to Shakespeare when you mentioned the role of the satirical in this reference to fattening up the worms. So I'm interested in if you could try to speak a little bit more about this relation between death and humor. Precisely what role humor plays in the account of death. Why is humor able to reveal finitude in particular? So this is kind of the question.
Thanks for your question. I mean, the Gravedigger scene is a great example of, I mean, it's a brilliant work of art in and of itself in the way that it moves from humor and joking and jocularity and then suddenly just shifts into something really moving and tragic. And I think that it's the juxtaposition and the opposition and the tension of those things in that scene that helps to make it such a powerful, effective scene and such a great text to make into live theater because of that. So, yeah, I mean, I think in general, the satirical handling of death in the early modern period needs to be connected to the way that people lived differently in relation to death at that time, that they were closer to it, that they weren't as, you know, in our society, we're much more alienated from death as a part of day-to-day life, and it's cordoned off, it's separated and it's repressed. Yeah, so I think there's at Shakespeare's time, there's more of a comfort level with satirical treatments of death, comic treatments of death, jokes about death. I mean, it's not that we don't have some of that now, but I think it's a very different historical context and a very different material practice of dealing with death and so forth. And so, you know, it's clearly a society post-Black Death where the bubonic plague is continuing, where the fear of death is all around, and it's also a pre-scientific society, so the understanding of the causes of death is also much more limited, so that tends toward, you know, fear of the unknown, and religion then fills that vacuum, fills that gap. But yeah, I think, you know, Hamlet is got a certain kind of sense of humor. I mean, the character Hamlet, which is a very dark, melancholic, you know, kind of humor which gives Shakespeare an opportunity to use all kinds of wonderful wordplay involving the diet of worms and in that particular passage that you mentioned. So, yeah.
I could probably ask maybe the final question in case there's no other question. Just to create some dialogue and discussion. I certainly felt a disagreement, which is good, between Daniel's and Mahmood's presentation, whereas I felt your Hamlet was a Hamlet that didn't want to go see beyond death. It was a death. It was a life that really ended with death, and there's therefore the melancholy and also the humor. Whereas with your Hamlet, it seems to be a tale of redemption. There's a politicization of the way in which death becomes a means for a greater cause. And obviously, I think you even use the word martyrdom. Am I correct to see this difference? Which is fine, given the fact Hamlet can be read in different ways. Obviously, you were approaching it in a very different way, but I'm just wondering if there's something here that we could discuss further with regards to Hamlet and the question of death and, of course, living politics and life on earth.
Well, I think what Daniel speaks about is perhaps a very scholarly reading of Hamlet, and there is no doubt about that. However, I am more interested in what Shakespeare does now. What does he mean today? You know, obviously, death does not mean the same death that we had 400 years ago. As you use the correct word, death is being hospitalized now. So we really have a different interpretation, different understanding. Now, why is it that Shakespeare still lives? Why is it that Shakespeare for the next 400 years will still live? Is that because, could it be because it applies to our situation today? And if we were to apply Shakespeare to our situation today, aren't we to read Hamlet's choice of ending as something that is good for his people, something that he wants to, basically, as I use the word martyr, he's martyring himself for the cause of a better society. You know, otherwise there is no reason for him to prophesy the election on Fortinbras. You know, why not Horatio? Why shouldn't Horatio take over after Hamlet? Why does he say Fortinbras? Could it be because Fortinbras presents a sort of normalcy, if you will, in which people can practice what they want, they can choose. So it is each citizen, each vote, according to Fortinbras.
Daniel, would you like to respond?
Well, that very question of the election lights on Fortinbras at the end is just a great example of the structure of unresolved contradiction, because, you know, on the one hand, it's, oh, Denmark is an elective monarchy, and maybe Fortinbras is this man of action who might be virtuous, and he needs to come in and clean things up and take over. On the other hand, he is the perennial hated enemy of the Danes. He is a military leader. He is coming in by force and taking over, and he is seizing the Machiavellian moment. And so both of those things are there. And that's what I was trying to say about the play as a whole in terms of how it treats the afterlife and how it treats Christian ideology is not, there's, as I said, there's a Christian reading that's there, but there's this kind of subtext of doubt that keeps emerging to challenge that. And you know, I look at these plays as texts that are very complex and, you know, contain these contradictions that are not resolved. And that lack of resolution is a very powerful thing for an audience member who then, you know, leaves the experience of the play talking about those contradictions and, you know, discussing them, and rather than being given a message on a platter and being said, this is the message of the play and you have to take it. I would see the question of Fortinbras at the end. I mean, if you're looking at both of those options, I mean, you got to push pretty hard for the election side, given the fact that, you know, Fortinbras is a Norwegian and he's a general, you know, so are the Danes really going to be, you know, I mean, maybe it'd be nice to have a more virtuous king than Claudius, but I mean, we don't know much about Fortinbras.
How about if you are to contemporize the play, how about the American exportation of democracy all over the world? Could America be another Fortinbras? Is that what the rest of the world might be looking up to for another militarism that's, you know, I mean, America is the next Fortinbras. It's a militaristic power. It's invading a country, right? It's exporting something, and it projects, not that it's real, it projects this myth of democracy, this myth of equal rights.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. I was going to ask, is that a new project to export democracy? Because it hasn't happened in the past. In 150 years, 178 wars, no democracy anywhere.
I never thought this discussion will go all the way here, but that's the wonderful. I think this was fantastic. I'm so sorry we have to end today's session now. You know, time was limited, and ultimately time is disjoint. However, as Ahmed famously said, I sincerely want to thank our guest speakers. Thank you so much, and also for the audience. I know it was hard and difficult to find this place, but hey, it was an adventure. We had a wonderful discussion, and it is to be continued for months and years to come. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Dan. All right, thank you.